One. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 2 of our podcast here on Mr. Coolio. I am Ty McGraw, and today I'm actually joined by historian John Launius. John?
Hi, how's everybody doing?
All right. Well, we have 3 folks here for the live show. We do this in 2 segments, or we do this 2 ways. One, we do this obviously live, as you're seeing here on Twitch, and then this recording goes through an editing process and then goes onto Spotify so that you can listen to it later at your convenience if you can't make the show tonight. So if you're listening on Spotify, thank you for coming and joining us. And if you're listening now live, thank you for joining us today. During these podcasts, I don't do any of the live streaming games, the videos, nothing like that. We just keep it on a blank screen, just like you would be listening on Spotify. Eventually, maybe we'll do slideshows or something of the sort, but this is only episode number 2, so we're sort of testing the waters when it comes to this. All right,
Fancy pictures.
Well, I'd like to let John introduce himself and give him a little backstory first before we get into the juicy details of what we're talking about today, if you will. So, John, I'll let you go ahead and take it away, sir.
So, my name is John Launius. As already been said, I'm a historian here in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I'm not really sure how much there is to say about me. I've never really thought of myself as being particularly interesting. Virginian by birth, but I've spent most of my life outside the state. Moved around a lot. Was born in Newport News, but lived in Arkansas, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Colorado. I've kind of been all over. I've been interested in the Civil War for basically as long as I can remember, and I feel pretty lucky to be able to talk about it for pay, which is a big bonus. Anybody can talk about anything for free.
Oh, sure. No, absolutely. But being able to talk about it with pay and have that platform too at the national, or just wherever you're giving tours or wherever you might be at, that's big. To have a group of people actually coming in and being able to talk to them wherever, if it's at a historic site, a museum, a battlefield, whatever. And then on top of that, having the bonus of being paid, that's dream come true, man. That's great.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad you've been able to make it back here in Fredericksburg, and let alone Virginia. Are you happy to be living back in Virginia? I know you said that's your place of birth. You're Virginian by birth. How's that
absolutely. It's sort of weird having been born in Virginia, but having lived most of my life outside the state. I've always wanted to live in Virginia. I've always sort of felt like I needed to come back, and fortunately, I was able to make that happen about a year and a half ago, and I've been living here in Fredericksburg ever since. And I don't expect to be leaving anytime soon.
As I agree. I've lived in Virginia my entire life, and I really wouldn't ever see myself trying to leave the state. And especially for us who are really interested in this, topic of Civil War history, you have a battlefield within stone's throw of your front door, and you can probably turn east or west and have one just right there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm within 15 miles of 4, within 50 miles of dozens more. I mean, one of the interesting things, of course, about Virginia is so much of the war happens here, but in such a small space compared to, say, the Western Theater. So you see a lot of the war in a very compact area.
Yeah, and especially this area, I think the area Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, Chancellorsville, and Wilderness collectively make up the bloodiest landscape in North America. We're losing about 100,000 lives, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yeah. So about 100,000 casualties between all 4 battles, and all 4 of them in the top 10 bloodiest single engagements of the war. So
right.
They are. I mean, some of the most brutal fighting of the war happens in this area.
Mm-hmm, absolutely, and it's incredible that we can still have some of that area to interpret, and also walk people around so they can hear the story and understand the history and the significance I think that this history really holds. So I'm glad we have those still for some folks to see. Preservation around here was very well done. I think it was the CVBT specifically that helped quite a bit, as well as the American Battlefield Trust.
Yeah,
and
so
the National Park Service, of course.
Yeah, so the National Park Service sort of kicks things off. Well, actually, it's the War Department that kicks things off.
Right, that's true. That's very true.
So that's sort of one of the things when you see something called a national battlefield, that usually means it started life as a part of the War Department.
Right.
And then it gets handed off to the Park Service in the 30s. And then you have the move to greater preservation. You have the trusts really starting to gain steam in the last half of the 20th century, and when they probably saved as much battlefield as the National Park Service has,
Right.
maybe by several orders of magnitude.
I mean, and that's incredible because that Antietam plan that they had in place, it worked for battlefields like Antietam and partially Gettysburg. And that Antietam plan, for layman's terms, would pretty much be that there are farmers in possession of these lands that are considered the battlefield, and that they take so much pride in the fact that this history happened on their fields that there's going to be an effort by these farmers to preserve and keep this within realms of visibility and accessibility for tourists and historians and military veterans alike. That worked for some places, again, in some places it didn't. Fredericksburg was definitely not one of those places where it worked. And I think post-World War II, we really start to see the diminishing of the Bloody Plain. And I believe it even started before World War II with the canal being dried and turned into a modern thoroughfare.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think maybe the classic example that I Will Smith tells, you look at the cornfield at Antietam,
right?
And it was a cornfield for 100 years before Antietam. It was a cornfield for 100 years after Antietam, and it's like the government comes and it's like, why would we spend a whole bunch of money buying a cornfield just to make sure it stays a cornfield? Why not just buy a right of way to build a road so people can drive by the cornfield?
Sure.
Problem solved, right? You get to see the battlefield, and the government gets to save money. Everybody wins, and that was a great plan until the massive level of urbanization that starts happening in this big corridor of Virginia,
right,
after World War II, which has unfortunately, as you said, gobbled up a lot of the Fredericksburg battlefield in particular.
I mean, it still continues to threaten a lot of places in Virginia. I mean, we're still seeing the American Battlefield Trust throwing up opportunities to save battlefields left and right, whether it be Cold Harbor, Trevilian Station, pieces of the Wilderness Battlefield, pieces of the Spotsylvania, like all these things pop up. So it's been really cool here recently to see how many are actually becoming for sale and how many agencies are trying to jump on the opportunity to save these battlefields from urban development. Because it's moving fast, especially in the Fredericksburg area. It continues to develop faster and faster each day.
Yeah, and it's sort of the great irony, right? You skimp on buying the land in the 1930s, the 1940s, because you're trying to save money. And now in 2021, the value of that land has increased exponentially, specifically because it's getting developed, and it actually becomes harder to preserve.
It does. And again, what an irony that is. Absolutely. Speaking of ironies, that sort of leads us into a semi-topic. Now, both John and I aren't going to dive terribly deep today into this, but it is nice to but it is, I think, important to talk about what's been happening today and then also relate that to the Civil War in 1861. Ironically enough, we are at 160 years on the outset of the Civil War, so 1861 to 2021, we would be bringing up to 160 years on the dot. Meaning we're coming up to, which I still can't believe, it feels like yesterday the 150th Manassas was taking place, but we're on the 160th anniversary of the First Battle of Manassas. To me, that's crazy to think about.
Yeah. And 1 year away from the 160th of Fredericksburg.
I remember participating in that, as a young reenactor, very young, high school age still, was reenacting in that battle, which was very, very fun, by the way. I mean, I'm not ever gonna have the chance to be shooting out of windows in downtown Fredericksburg again in a reenactment. I could tell you that much. That was insane. And I think that even itself, like, I'm not to veer off too much, but the appreciation I got, doing that, because there was one day where I was able to, I did both sides, because in the reenactment field, what you would call a galvanized soldier, I like to participate in both and try to just get a better understanding. Plus, when I'm reenacting as Union, we have significantly better coffee, so that is a plus as well.
So there is the better tobacco.
Oh man, right, they do. And I got a corncob pipe, and every time I go to Gettysburg, I'd go to Gettysburg Tobacco and get Longstreet Tobacco, which is a peach flavor, or not Longstreet Tobacco. Almost said McClaw's. Wow, Barksdale. They have the William Barksdale. It's a peach flavored tobacco, and the Longstreet's the Virginia blend, ironically.
Right.
Yeah, and it's like, didn't he get Georgian? We're talking, or South Carolinian or Georgian, right?
He's a South Carolinian.
South Carolinian. Okay, I don't know why I said Georgian.
I think he might be Georgian by birth, but he was South Carolinian by choice.
Gotcha. South Carolinian by choice. Now he, for some reason again, has that Virginia blend tobacco, but I would do that as well, just to try to get the authenticity. But still, when we did that during the 150th, I did Confederates for the street fighting. And I mean, honestly, Marie's Heights, there was a lot of people that wanted to be behind the stone wall, but when you're doing a reenactment, it's kind of good to put it into perspective on, just what it's like. And again, this is nowhere near comparison to charging actual Marie's Heights, where we did it at Federal Hill. But just even the constant smoke and gunfire that was taking place from the amount of reenactors that we had would actually scare the crap out of you, man. Like, I'm not gonna lie to you, that was still like, I hope no one put a ramrod in that. I mean, it's still just, but not even that, just the tenacity of even charging that and hearing that concentration of fire was something that was just indescribable between that and then the salute that they did when they were simulating the bombardment of Fredericksburg when the National Guard did those dry fire cannon runs. That was, oh man, gives you a whole new respect for the battle. And I think that was a big takeaway from the 150th is some of the things we were able to simulate and show the general public. And now going into the 160th during a pandemic, it's interesting how we're going to tackle that. And on top of a pandemic, some major historical events that have taken place that, I mean, I don't think it's going to necessarily draw a major shift to the way we interpret and teach the Civil War. But at the same time, I think there's now going to be a larger interest, maybe not a larger interest, but there might be some folks that might be picking up a book or two or somehow finding their way to a battlefield, even amidst the pandemic. And maybe you can share your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. People are still definitely going to battlefields. But maybe not as many as usual. But people are still going in, and the people that are going are sometimes a little bit different. They're a bit more local, right? People are traveling less.
Right.
But as a result, people are also cooped up in their homes, and they're desperate for green space. And we were just talking about how much urbanization there has been in this area. In a lot of areas, the nearby national park might be the only significant green space. And in this area of Virginia, a lot of time that's a battlefield, even if people don't realize it.
Yeah, and so that's bringing maybe an unintentional visitor that wanted to go there to study history and then spends their time so much during this pandemic frequenting this battlefield that they stop and start reading some of the signs they may have jogged past or may have ran their dog past. And now they're like, wait a minute, this happened here? Oh, I didn't realize it was this bad or this battle was this important.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that constantly surprises people when they come to Civil War battlefields, at least that I find, is how large they are.
Right.
I mean, if I had a nickel for every time I talk to somebody at Marie's Heights, and they say, "Oh, we just saw the battlefield," I'm like, "Oh, well, you've seen part of the battlefield." And like, "What do you mean?" It's like the Confederate battle lines here are almost 7 miles long.
Right. I mean, and I honestly, the best appreciation I ended up getting for that was even beyond my time at the Park Service. Believe it or not, it was when I was commuting to Washington on a train. Because even the train ride is kind of a laborious wait until you get to the Fredericksburg station from Spotsylvania. And it takes you through the entire front of Fredericksburg, which I think is awesome. It's literally, well, of course, we know the battle was kind of focused on those modes of transportation and those routes to access Richmond. So following that route along the railroad, you're just like, the lines, the amount of men that it took to staff and fold those lines, and just the sheer numbers that actually went into battle along those lines are astronomical. And seeing it and riding that and looking at the terrain, again, I think gave me a much better appreciation than what I was looking at even as an interpreter when I was interning back in 2016 up to 2018. It's never really had that opportunity to like full scale spend a few minutes like moving along, even in a train, just along the whole length of it. But you get that from driving Lee Drive too, I guess. That's a good comparison.
Yeah, but there is something, just sort of wonderful about train travel in general. That
Absolutely.
Because you're not having to focus on actually operating a motor vehicle.
Right. Spend a minute looking out the window. And it's funny too, because we have history with the trains in Fredericksburg. I mean, the Meade Pyramid and Jackson, or the Stonewall Jackson death site now, takes me a few minutes to get used to that change, by the way, but I'm glad.
Yes.
Yeah, very glad. The death site and the what they call the Meade Pyramid were actually train stops and managed by at one time the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad.
Yep.
So those are really cool itself.
The railroad is why the death site still exists.
Correct. And I believe the president of the RF&P at the time was a Confederate officer of some sort. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm forgetting his last name. I know his last name was White, but I'm forgetting
Myers.
His full name. Yeah.
Was it Myers?
Myers White, I believe that's him.
That sounds.
He purchased the property personally and then transferred it to railroad ownership about a year later.
Oh,
This
that's
is,
cool.
I want to say 1929 is when he buys it.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
No, it was before that. No, it
Oh, it was
was
before that.
no. 19, I think it was in the 19 teens.
Okay.
It's been so long since I've been down there. I'll have to double check that.
Yeah, that'd be nice to know.
Because they first open it, like it first gets opened to visitors in 1921, if I remember correctly, and that was the wives of railroad employees who actually ran it were the first interpreters down there.
No kidding.
Yeah,
I feel like I remember reading that, but at the same time, I just that never really rang to me. That's insane. No kidding.
yeah. I mean, it's one of these things that uh, the women of the South play such a huge role in the creation of the memory of the war.
Yes.
I mean, the UDC, Daughters of the Confederacy, of course, is both famous and infamous for their efforts to preserve their version of the war, shall we say?
And that, we see that a lot in the monuments around our parks too. We have monuments to different crossing sites from Fredericksburg. We have monuments to individual regiments alongside highways. We have some monuments. We even have a Confederate monument in the cemetery, which one day I do want to do a topic on, because that my great grandfather's. Yep, he was captured actually at where that monument's located during the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, and was imprisoned at Point Lookout and getting processed through Chatham Manor. So I have that little cool connection there when it comes to family history during the Civil War. My great grandfather captured up there in Marie's Heights. Well, Willis Hill, as they would call it. I guess there's a difference between Marie's Heights isn't just the entire ridge. I think that's really more centered around the Brompton house, but I think the rest of it, we really call it Willis Hill. Or
yeah, the part that's the majority of the part that people see today is more properly called Willis Hill.
Correct.
But Marie's Heights has kind of become the moniker for that entire ridgeline.
Yeah, and it's kind of a small height when the vicinity of Marie's Heights isn't really a vast area. It's kind of really small if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of interesting. I was just talking about how big these battlefields were, but it's also interesting how they can be both big, and yet how the fighting can become super concentrated in these comparatively small areas.
Bloody Angle,
Marie's Heights, Prospect Hill, the intersections at the Wilderness.
Right. I mean, and the Bloody Angle, touching on that again really quickly before we dive into Washington, that blew me away when I learned about that, because initially, when I was just a young lad going to the battlefields left and right, I always thought the entire Muleshoe, well, young lad, I don't know why I just used that like I'm some old strapping young man, but it's crazy to think the Muleshoe itself is not the entirety of the Bloody Angle, you know what I mean, or the other way around. I always had the impression that the entire Muleshoe was what they called the Bloody Angle fighting, and that this was just an all-over thing. I didn't really take into consideration that this one small, half-acre plot of land was really where some of the most intense fighting of the war was seen for 22 straight hours.
And it's kind of funny when you actually go to the Bloody Angle proper, like, it's not that much of an angle. It's actually kind of underwhelming. It was important not so much because of the angle, but because of the slight rise it was on that commanded the trenches on either side of it.
Yes, sir. That's incredibly true. Like that's the one thing you look to, and then the terrain also plays a huge feature into that battle. And then even seeing some of the forward trench lines and the defenses that are still visible today, it does definitely kind of create a difficult situation in identifying the Bloody Angle, because you're right, there is no angle to it per se. It's really sort of just a straight and almost a straight line. Mm-hmm. Because, and I got a lot of people thinking that the apex, when I was giving Bloody Angle walking tours, they were always thinking the apex was the Bloody Angle. I'm like, oh no, sir.
Yeah, everyone thinks the east angle is the Bloody Angle. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, the actual Bloody Angle was this very, very shallow, very, very obtuse angle. It is almost a straight line.
And when you tell them that, the nature of the tour kind of turns. It gets a little quieter from their part. You can see the realization of, oh man, this was a lot worse than I thought when they arrived, because Spotsylvania is so overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
But without further ado, I reckon we should probably jump into this topic, just briefly touch on it, and then return to some just good casual conversation, because I think a lot comes good from that too. But we are sitting in the outset of the third week of January in 2021. And even just beginning the third week, we have seen some very unprecedented historic events that have happened.
Yeah, 2021 had a good 6 days.
It did. Oh my gosh, the 6 day in is where I think I don't want to say spark, but just something definitely changed in our way of life. And if you follow the news, and I'm sure every American or anybody around the world that could possibly be listening to this, I'm sure you're well aware that the United States Capitol was stormed on January 6th, 2021. And that hasn't happened since the British ran in and burned the thing down. Luckily, we didn't lose the Capitol, thankfully. But we did, I think, maybe lose a sense of security as a nation.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I really think there's always been this idea, and maybe it sort of falls into the kind of toxic side of American exceptionalism.
right.
This idea that, like, these are things that just cannot happen here.
Mm-hmm.
And to some degree, that's been true, very fortunately for us.
Yes.
Uh, but I think at least some Americans, a lot of Americans, got a bit of a wake up call on January 6th. You know, there's that famous line um, uh, Benjamin
Mm-hmm.
after the Constitutional Convention, where he says, "Hey, you know what?" And there's the story where the lady asks you, "You know, what have you given us?" He says, "We give a republic if you can keep it." I think there is an argument that probably for the first time since the Civil War, January 6th is when a lot of Americans sat down. It's like, oh, we can't actually lose this.
Right. We are. I mean, if anyone didn't believe that there was a strong, divisive nature in America at this point, I think January 6th, like you said, was that wake up call. They're now like, wait a minute, somebody just stormed that building, somebody just took it over, and that's straight partisan takeover, if anything. You know, this isn't related to just, I guess, maybe more of a social issue. This is a political issue that has been taken to a point of insurrection. And, you know, when social issues and political issues get taken to a point of insurrection, it's at a boiling point, maybe? Maybe that's a good way to say it. Like, we're at a point now where it could swing either way. There's ways for this to be resolved. You know, we turn to history, we see a multitude of different ways that situations like this were resolved. I don't want to be someone who does guesswork here or is the one throwing around, oh, we're going to have a second civil war. 'Cause I don't like to buy into all that talk, because that's very alarming when people are doing that, and that could send out a lot of issues. But I do like to draw parallels to history and what history has to say for situations like this, because as Lincoln said, we always like to turn to our better angels, and that was one thing since this day on January 6th. I've been turning to a lot of different time periods throughout Washington, or throughout our histories, you know, throughout our nation's short history, I should say. I'm trying to find better angels in situations like this, and the ones I'm finding all tend to be in the Civil War era or a little bit after. You know, and that's just my thoughts on it so far. And being someone who actually works in the Capitol and witnessing this happen firsthand.
I mean, you had to go to work the day after. Or
yeah, the following day after
Yeah.
that. Yeah, so I was there the 8th. I went back in, and just even seeing some of the destruction. I have pictures of like windows smashed. There were tear gas residue all over the floors. Most of the statues had plastic bags hung over their heads. There were fuck Antifa signs taped in the Capitol. You know what I mean? People were smoking cigarettes inside the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, you could see the destruction that was done, and more so on the Senate side than the House side. And then where I was at I was actually leaving and getting out of D.C., but it was hard to move anywhere when the entirety of your walk to the train station is completely blocked by protesters. You know, so you're using an opportunity to maybe get an understanding of what's going on, and you start speaking to some of these people, not knowing that an hour later, some of these same people you were speaking to are walking around inside the Capitol holding true to some of the words you caught them saying beforehand. That was one of the things that really, you know, set in after the fact, that I realized, oh my God, like, this guy literally said an hour before that we need to tear down these walls and run up inside the Capitol. What? You know, you don't think anything of it. You think that's just the crazy talk that you normally hear, that inflaming talk. But then to see it actually carried out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you see people or hear people say stuff like that, you know, but you don't believe them, because
No.
again, like I was saying, like, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, that's stuff that happens in petty South American or African dictatorships, right? Like,
Yeah.
this isn't something that happens in America. Well,
No, Washington's the most secure city in the world, right?
but and I think we have to come with, again, sort of this idea of maybe the toxic side of American exceptionalism. Turns out we're really not that different, maybe under the right circumstances.
Right. And once you reach that point, the people take it into their own hands, and whether it be for the good or for the bad, that's been a thing with America, I think, too. It's just, I don't think it's ever gotten to the point where, we've seen federal buildings protested and stormed before, but never one as significant as the Capitol building.
Mm-hmm.
That's a message sender right there.
Oh, yeah.
That was the goal. And it was incited by a sitting president, which is a whole other topic, that this wasn't just a people insurrection. This was incited by one of the highest levels, if the highest level of federal government in the United States.
I mean, whether he meant it that way or not,
right,
which I think is still a little bit up for question.
Sure.
It is. It's certainly true that the people storming the Capitol building certainly believed he meant it that way.
Right. And that's what I should say. I mean, that's the interpretation I'm taking too, is these people took it as a literal, let's go storm it. This is what he said. And they're using that as their excuse, is that their president told them to.
And the reality is whether President Trump meant his words to mean that, I think there's still culpability there, because there's no way he didn't know how aggravated that crowd was, that he hadn't seen the same intelligence reports that everybody else had seen, that there was concern about violence at the Capitol, right. And he still goes out and he riles up the crowd, and he uses divisive language. He pumps up conspiracy theories. Whether he actually thought they were going to do that or not, like, it's hard to look at what he says and place it in context and wonder, like, there are just some things you don't have to say, and if there's one sentence he doesn't say, maybe the storming of the Capitol building doesn't happen.
Okay, we'll say it didn't. Yeah, maybe it didn't. That would be something. But with that, again, it just, now the situation I've been working again since this has happened almost every single day except maybe a Saturday and a Sunday, and I'm because of the security of the situation, I'm not able to even go to work until Thursday, after the inauguration, which to me I'm partial to, because I was really excited to be able to experience my first inauguration. A year and a half ago, before this virus even hit, I wasn't considering the fact that I would be social distancing at inauguration. That was
right.
3 weeks ago. My only complaint was, man, I'm gonna have to stand way far away. That in that 3 weeks, I didn't know that I was going to be staying at home, because there are threats of armed takeover from the Capitol, and there are thousands and thousands of armed National Guard that are now guarding my workplace. Somewhere, my walk to work is hampered by 1.5 miles now, so I'm walking 1.5 miles around a barricaded, barbed wired, gun guarded fence just to get to work.
Yeah, and talking about parallels to 1861,
right?
I believe this is the first time that U.S. soldiers have been quartered in the Capitol building since the Civil War.
And certainly has been. But again, back to the Little Better Angels comment, I've tried to look at any other situation, and even during the Vietnam War riots and the protests, I wouldn't even call them riots in D.C. so much as they were protests. That this didn't happen. There were guards, yes, sure, but on this magnitude, absolutely not. Even during the Vietnam War, you didn't have protesters storming the Capitol. They erected fences and threw medals back over the Capitol. But even still, those veterans didn't run up in there and storm the building. Mm-mm. They didn't cause this much of a panic in Washington that there needed to be a guard presence the way there is.
20,000, I think, is going to be the number they're going to hit before Inauguration Day. And there's been a lot of news made of that's a larger U.S. military presence than is in Iraq and Afghanistan right now combined.
And did we even have that many numbers during the Civil War when it was occupied? Were there 20,000 Union troops stationed at the Capitol building in 1861?
In the Capitol building, I don't believe so. There were certainly quite a bit more than that stationed around the D.C., but not localized in such a small space.
Yeah, that's unprecedented there too, I think. And you're right. There were more than enough soldiers in the D.C. area during the Civil War, but just stationed at the Capitol like it is now, that's got to say something.
Yeah, and a lot of the guys who would have been in D.C. during that time weren't even necessarily there on duty. They were there in transit.
Yeah.
D.C. was a major transit hub. for federal troops during the war.
Right. And, yes, you had your forts, you had, all of those in the area as well. But like you said, it was kind of a rail stop for these soldiers that are heading south or heading to the western theater of the war. They would all come through Washington. Not all of them, but most of them do come through Washington at one point. And a lot of these journals and letters that I read from Union soldiers, specifically in the AOP, all, talk about being in Washington for a little bit. And some of the things that they see there, and that's another, fun topic too, is just the atmosphere of Washington in 1861 is very replicative of today too. A lot of the things we're reading, about Washington, and not that Washington has, changed much when it comes to that being the political powerhouse of the United States and the center of all of that. But it just, the way it reads in some of the histories is very interesting to how it reads today in the newspapers.
Yeah, it'll be. It makes one wonder what people are going to think back on this point in time, 150, 160 years from now, and what parallels they may draw between what's happening now and what comes after this and the Civil War.
Wow, I've never even thought that far ahead yet, man. That's something to think about too. Yeah, because there's so much in the now that I'm trying to focus on. It's like I didn't even try to even compare that yet. Wow. That can be pretty serious of them comparing our time. And to think they're going to be using things like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube.
Yeah, the tools of the historians studying the 21st century will probably look nothing like the tools we use today, if for no other reason than because the way we communicate has changed so much.
No, incredible. Yeah, it has. So a little bit on Washington too. I've been able to gather a few things, and like we said at the start, this isn't necessarily my strong suit either when it comes to the Civil War. I haven't studied this portion of Washington. I actually picked it up this morning, so mind you, this is just one day's worth of collecting some stuff I thought was important, and John too, I would love to have him comment on this. But we'll finish off after this section, kind of just talking about the relationship between Washington and Fredericksburg, as both John and I have plenty of experience here in Fredericksburg, and Washington does play an extremely important role when it comes to the way the Battle of Fredericksburg does play out. I think that'd be fun to just draw a few little parallels to that too.
But, yeah, I mean, the Washington and the defense of Washington particularly plays a super important role in just about everything the Army of the Potomac does, at least through the early parts of 1864.
Yeah.
When McClellan makes this plan to go down to the peninsula, which of course is quite a bit before Fredericksburg, one of the first questions that Lincoln asks him is, okay, well, how are you going to protect Washington? So I think I was joking with you earlier, where I was telling Jeff Davis says Fredericksburg was right in the wrong place.
It was, absolutely. I mean, sitting directly halfway between Washington and Richmond, which we all know are two opposing capitals. That's not a strategigic place to be sitting in the middle of a civil war.
It's not a nice place to be sitting.
Not at all.
When you're a road junction. You're near a bunch of other road junctions, when one of the largest and highest capacity railroads in the region goes right from you to one of those capitals and very near the other. Fredericksburg became an incredibly important strategic location. And it also, another really important thing, of course, is moving through this area allows the Army of the Potomac to both go on the offensive, but still keep itself in between the majority of Confederate forces and Washington, D.C.
I should say that it is strategic. I shouldn't say it isn't a strategic place, because absolutely, when you said that, the transportation route being centered directly between two capitals, yeah, I guess it does have some strategic importance to it in that regard. Very much so. And we know one of the things that I noticed about just D.C. was there was a specific quote that actually stuck out this morning that I was reading, and it's actually uttered by the architect of the Capitol at the time, was known as Thomas Eustace Walter. Now, Walter is a very interesting individual when it came to him being the architect. He was actually a Philadelphian, so the guy obviously is being from Philadelphia, and he's one of those German American that we hear about throughout the Civil War quite a bit. Loved and hated, and very eccentric. Now, he has deep roots to the north, obviously, so we know where his sediments are going to lie when he comes in. But he's also, by nature, a Democrat. So it's a terror for him when the war breaks out. And one of the quotes that he utters about it in regards to that quote, he says, and I quote, "Our country is in the midst of a terrible partisan conflict, and we are in the vortex of it." And to me, that really hit home.
Yeah.
Again, working at the Capitol and experiencing the riot firsthand, and hearing or reading that quote this morning, I sat mouth open staring. I was like, if that man could have summed up the way DC or working in DC or just the way we feel right now as a country, I think that quote really, really plays a. I'm losing words for it because it's so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, when the war begins in '61, DC is in a very precarious place. Virginia secedes, so literally half of the national capital is functionally in enemy territory. Maryland's loyalties are questionable at best.
We see the suspension of habeas corpus because of that directly, if I'm not mistaken. That's when there are sitting members of Congress arrested for their questionable loyalty.
There's fear that if Baltimore goes secession, not even necessarily the entire state of Maryland, it just has to be Baltimore. DC is effectively cut off from the rest of the country.
DC is susceptible to a lot of things. We see political riots today on a mass scale. We saw the Capitol. Another one we see at the beginning of the election night is the Tremont House incident. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not.
I'm not.
So I'm sure you are familiar with the Wide Awakes.
Yes.
Very eccentric group of protesters, I wouldn't say protesters, but technically that's what they ended up being, because they would take to the streets and they had the oilcloth capes and caps and they had torches and they would carry fence rails, because as we know, Lincoln was the rail splitter. He gets that subsequent nickname actually debating and running the debate floors while he was campaigning for Congress, if I'm not mistaken. It actually runs all the way back to his congressional days. But that's where they get the term, the rail splitter, and they use because of his roots. And I think he even put a piece of wood on a chopping block and split it as a promotional during one of his debates. But that gives him that link, the great rail splitter, and so the Wide Awakes take that. But they're in 1860, right around the election era, running around Washington, really trying to advocate for Lincoln and showing out in force. And when Lincoln's elected, there's a mass riot in 1860 in the Capitol, and it's these Wide Awakes that are now hiding on top of a 3-story building 3 blocks away from the Capitol, the Tremont House, while there are Democrats threatening to burn it down, burn the building down, firing wildly into the air, drunken on free whiskey, because whiskey is being handed out aplenty in Washington those days. But again, that type of dissent and that type of insurrection behavior that we're seeing around an election, that, mind you, again, the election in 1861 paralleled this here, because we're looking at Lincoln with a 39.9% of a popular vote, but 59.4% of an electoral vote. So obviously these rioters that are rioting against the Wide Awakes are rioting from what they see today as an unfair election, or an election that didn't make sense. And that's exactly what we're dealing with today.
I mean, if you got those kind of numbers today, you would have riots in the streets.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously our numbers today are a lot starkly different than 39.9 and 59.4. But I mean, you get the president saying that it's stolen, and these people obviously devoted, as the rail splitters and the Democrats were devoted to their candidate, things can turn very violent very fast.
I mean, at least we don't have congressional representatives beating each other with canes in the middle of session.
You aren't kidding. That's
we haven't had that.
No,
we haven't had that happen yet.
We have not, and I hate that you said yet, because it's something we can't rule out. It's really not. I mean, who's to say that's not going to happen? We saw Josh Hawley showing an act of solidarity, if you will, is what they call it, where he holds his hand up and his fist up, showing that he's empowering these protesters. That sends a bad message too.
And I'm trying to remember. I think there was actually a recently elected congresswoman, I believe, who says that she wants to carry her handgun.
Marjorie Greene, right?
Yeah.
No. Or is that the lady from Colorado? The lady
she is from Colorado.
And she's first thing. Not that because I'm not completed with college yet, and I've made it very far as well. But she doesn't have a degree coming in here. She was a bartender for a pro to a bar. that got elected to Congress too. Which, yeah, I pro 2A all the way. I mean, don't get me wrong, everybody should be able to. It's a constitutional right. You got what you got, whatever. But still, to come into Congress and start making your own rules.
Right. I mean, me. I'm pretty pro 2A.
Right. Absolutely.
But it's also like, even the founders believed there were limits.
Yep.
Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the guy who literally wrote the Second Amendment with his own hand, both, and Thomas Jefferson, arguably you could argue sort of the ideological core of the American Revolution, and are in almost certainly the most radical of the core group of founding fathers, as far as limited government is concerned, at least. And both voted to restrict weapons on the University of Virginia campus. So the guy who wrote the Second Amendment believed in gun-free zones.
That's insane to think about too. And looking at, again, when we were talking about going off of the election and how that played out today and how it plays out in the Civil War too. And you mentioned it too, where D.C.'s location, Maryland and Virginia are the ones that enclosed the Capitol along the Potomac River there. And that itself was a very difficult thing to handle because of, again, the partisanship you have there. You have the hot-headed politicians in the South that are instantly screaming of secession. There was secrets about mounting a coup to prevent the president-elect from taking office. Again, the National Volunteers rioting members tried to burn down our Republican headquarters. These are extremists on both sides that use this election as the excuse to start, radicalizing more. And abolitionists who at the time were also considered somewhat radical. I mean, and I understand, the cause is whatever it may be. They're trying to sit here and free slavery, of course, but it doesn't change the fact that these are still radicalized ideologies that they're carrying out. And again, that's not right.
At the time.
Absolutely. Depending on what we view it today, that's irrelevant compared to what it was for them then. There was a little bit of a different scenario going on, but that's kind of what you're seeing in that regard too. And we're seeing, again, you have some different causes, of course, but these same outcomes with the political riots, the talk of staging a coup. You had protesters that were inside the Capitol ready to go get Mike Pence for not counting votes the way Trump wanted him to count votes, with zip ties and threatening harm to Congress people. It's crazy to think about. And the scenes of the Capitol now, the way it looks today compared to the way it looked then, it's a lot more of a secure place now, despite it being broken into, of course. But what I mean by that is, we've been closed to the public since March of 2020. Mm-hmm. I remember specifically the day they finally shut the doors at the Capitol Visitor Center, and we've been in lockdown ever since. Again, compared to the war when this broke out, and I was talking to John about this earlier, you could have vendors inside the hallways of the Capitol that would be selling fruit. They'd sell beer to the members. They'd sell souvenirs, and congressmen would go get drunk at the local watering holes and vote that way at the freaking bar.
Yeah. I wonder maybe if we'd be better off if everyone in Congress was drunk.
That, you know what, that would probably maybe it wouldn't be so lame duck, and maybe we'd get some stuff done to get some motivation there. But that's just to see, the stark contrast and how I guess this could jump off so quickly, and how something so dramatic as a break-in could happen.
Yeah, maybe that's where all our problems started. We stopped letting our congressmen and women get smashed.
What does it say? And everything is good when you're fat and happy, and these guys weren't doing that. So now they're not doing that. They're eating healthy, and they're eating all the keto diets, and no more plastic in the buildings, which is good. I'm glad we're saving the environment now. I'm really glad they finally caught on to that. We are making people use reusable water bottles. Mm-hmm. I think that's awesome. No more plastic in the building. Cool by me. The only thing is they replaced it with aluminum. So I'm like, okay, now we're just putting a bunch of cans in here. That's not all right.
Well, okay. I mean, if you do it right, you can reuse the aluminum. You can readily, and the plastic.
And I will say most people do actually recycle up there, which is actually really nice to see, and it's kind of heartening. We do have some numbers, too, just to put it into perspective about D.C. And today I'm not going to bring in any modern-day numbers because those vary between the people traveling in and out of Washington, but we do have some from D.C. in 1860 with the census, and we had 75,080 people living in D.C. 61,000 of them directly in Washington City and 8,700 of them in Georgetown, and about 5,000 in what at the point was a rural remainder of the District of Columbia. Now, of that, about 11,000 were free blacks, and about 3,000 were slaves. Now, D.C. was a little interesting when it came to the slaveholding laws that were in place. This one comes from 1791 and was still in effect by 1860 because there was something called the Black Code. And it was a pretty much clear and direct verbatim copy of what Maryland was going by at the time. And that required the free black citizens to carry a residence permit. And if they didn't have that on them, it was pretty much you were sold to slavery. There was no way around that if you didn't carry this very important piece of paper to dictate that you were a freed man or a freed woman. This also told them how they could worship, how they could drive carriages, who could race horses and swim in the Potomac and walk abroad after 10 p.m. because if you were caught out after 10, you were considered contraband, you were sold south. And these restrictions, they really took place and had some very, very hard effects on them, but some of them were able to obviously circumnavigate that, and one of those is James T. Wormley, and this isn't much to do with what we're talking about, but I did find it funny and rather interesting that General-in-Chief Winfield Scott's landlord was James T. Wormley, a free black.
Oh.
Yes. So I didn't know that, and I saw that, I was like, well, damn, that's pretty good to hear.
That's interesting.
But yeah, I never knew that either. I was just like, I will be damned. I mean, that was like when I first found out about Martha Stevens and John Innes, that whole ordeal. Like that blew my mind too. I was just like, first of all, women owning property in '62 is virtually unheard of, and this woman's doing everything.
Martha Stevens. That's a story for another day.
It is. And now, again, I haven't really touched about Wednesday's episode that we'll be doing for you guys, but Wednesday's episode promises to be very exciting when it comes to our Washington topic, because I am going to cut Washington off at this next stop because I'd like to really dive in when we have an expert on Washington joining us next Wednesday. That is historian Steve Fan, very wonderful and very knowledgeable in the realm of Washington during the Civil War, including the forts, so it'll be fun to pick his brain and dive a little more in depth on the day of the inauguration, because who knows how the inauguration is going to play out, so we can bring maybe some fresh perspectives later that evening. But I'm going to stop us at our Washington conversation and then finish us out today with John and myself talking more on the Fredericksburg and Washington connection. But I want to talk about Dr. George William Bagby, because I'm very big on talking about a lot of the newspapers that come out of the time period, because those are some insightful pieces of paper.
Absolutely.
Very much. Now, Bagby is writing for two very interesting newspapers. One is the New Orleans Crescent, and the other is the Richmond Dispatch, but he's living in Washington in Willard's Hotel. His description of Washington, again, I'm loving these descriptions that I'm getting because I'm just looking at it and I'm like, wow, it sounds like today. He says, the city is the paradise of paradoxes. A great little splendid, mean, extravagant, poverty-stricken barrack. The one and only absolute certain thing is the absence of everything that is at all permanent. I don't know whether that's a very damning thing to say for our future, or what kind of symbology you can pull off of that quote itself. But that again, that was one of those ones that, with all the turmoil given and everything we've been going through, I thought that was very interesting when it comes to, transitions of power and, people that may try to cling to that. You're like, well, look, nothing's permanent in this city. It's absolutely certain that nothing is permanent in this city. So it's something, something to just mull over, I reckon, and just think about.
Yeah, for some reason that makes me think of all of the buildings that were built in D.C. during World War II as a part of the administration of the war,
right?
And how you've sort of got a similar thing going on during the Civil War, because you have the U.S. military expanding at an absolutely unprecedented rate, and you have all of these guys trying to figure out how do we keep this massive war machine running. And it's true that Washington has sort of seen these time periods where there's been this massive influx of power and administration during crisis, only for that power then to wane or to be repurposed.
Sure.
Once it's over. I don't know why I'm not sure why that's what it made me think of, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
I'm glad you drew that because that's a perspective I would have never drawn, and that's something now that for me to sit here and mull over as well, because that's very, very true. Like that. See, this is good. This is why we've got good perspectives on this. I mean, different ideas. We all draw different things from different quotes, and I've noticed that, talking amongst many different historians, that a lot of the stuff that we think might be common when we read these things, that this is what everybody thinks, is, way different than what the reality might really be, or what this person might think about one thing. And I guess that, to me, it changes a little bit on how I should interpret. Maybe, you can count on that too, but when we hear different perspectives, it does open up maybe a different perspective yourself on how a battle may play out, or how a political decision may have turned the tide of the war. It just different things. I guess I'm running off with that.
Historical interpreters are absolute thieves. Where they will listen to someone else come up with a good idea or a good perspective, and it's like, I'm gonna use that for myself.
100%. 100%. I think I'm guilty myself. I'm not even gonna fake it.
I would argue that that's one of the strengths of being of not just being a historian, but being a historical interpreter, where your job is to actively engage with the history and help others engage with the history on a regular basis. It sort of forces you to be open to new perspectives, because you can't just sort of hide away in your library.
No.
And and write from your big fancy wooden desk with your pipe, and in a cloud of tobacco smoke. I guess this is like what I've always thought of, like the traditional historian, squirreled away in a library in like a cardigan or something.
So long as they have that leather wing chair, that's it. That's all it takes. You just gotta have that leather wing chair, the pipe, and the books, and you're good.
100%. and a big antique wooden desk.
I've got one of those. That's what I'm talking to you guys from right now. I guess I'm already there. It was my dad's too, so here we're already adding some history to it.
My desk folds in half.
Oh man,
mine is not antique or made of any wood whatsoever.
Look, as nice as it is, and as much as I love it, do you know how much of a pain in the ass it's going to be to transport this thing when I finally move to an apartment that has 5 flights of stairs, and I'm like, how the heck do I get an executive office desk up there?
Yeah, have fun with that.
Yeah, logistically speaking, not a great idea to invest in it at 21 years old, or get it back to the house at 21 years old, but at the same time, I wouldn't trade it for the world, because it is my little retreat. If I need to go study, it has helped me significantly study, believe it or not, because it's that environmental, it's aesthetic. It's like, wow, this is...
There's something to that. There's absolutely something to that.
Absolutely. But at the end of the day too, you don't have to be a doctor, PhD to be a historian. If you understand it, you can genuinely be in the mindset of, you're not going to try to make anything up and not try to distort fact from fiction and try to change all that. I think you have what it takes to be a historian. I think challenging traditional history that you may have found, something new when it comes to the evidence and first source material, challenging that and trying to gain different perspectives, and of course finding other historians' perspectives and even either challenging that or going along with it. That's what makes and breaks a historian. That's how you really, flatten that mold, because...
Absolutely. I mean, some of the most impressive, most important historians in world history have had no formal training.
Right. And that's the beautiful thing about it.
I remember back in school taking a historiography and research methods course, and one of the sections we focused on was women, female history, and history written by women. Specifically at times when women were considered sort of not capable of doing history, and how you have things that like in the 1890s or whatever, we read a diary from a woman in Brazil from the 1890s. And
right.
It's this is the kind of thing that the average historian, professional historian of the time period would find absolutely no value in. But it's, an absolutely, vitally important piece of history that we would have no access to without the efforts of this woman who recorded her daily life and the world around her.
Sure. And I think that's important to know too. Now, maybe you've read this real quick before we get into our Frederick's topic. Have you talked or ever read a book by the name of The Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin?
I'm familiar with that. I haven't read it.
Okay, I was thinking about grabbing that and maybe reading it and doing a little bit with the podcast with it. I'm not too sure yet, but it's just something that pops in my mind. But I also want to steer away from doing a lot of like political talk with it and really focus on the battles that you and I know so well. But
Yeah,
it was something to think
my
about.
understanding that the film Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, a lot of that was based off of Team of Rivals.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. All right, sorry to
At least I
deviate
believe
again.
that's true. I might be making that up, but I'm pretty sure that's true.
All right. Well, I think you're right, though. I do believe I've heard that from time to time. I think the book maybe even says on it, like, movie-based or something like that. Now a major motion picture or something. But let's talk about Fredericksburg for a few minutes before we get out of here today and conclude our second episode. Washington, D.C. in regards to the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. How do we even start that conversation?
Well, I mean, I think we start that conversation by understanding that the protection of DC in many ways was the primary role of the Army of the Potomac for much of the early part of the war.
Yeah.
Like, yes, their job is to go out and fight the enemy, but not at the expense of leaving DC open to attack.
Absolutely.
The protection of DC is always a fundamental part of planning when it comes to building a campaign. There's also the fact that, as we were talking about before, DC is a major supply and logistics base for the federal forces. It's a major road and rail network by nature of being the capital of the United States. You know, everything on the East Coast goes to DC.
Indeed, it does. And that, you know, when I guess McClellan is removing himself from Sharpsburg and brings himself down to, I guess, outside of Warrenton, Virginia. I think that's when Washington really decides to set its sights on Lincoln specifically, replacing McClellan and bringing somebody in that'll be more competent and more effective as a commander than McClellan was being. Hopefully, yeah. We were having some very wishful thinking in 1862, aren't we? Well, they select General Ambrose Everett Burnside, who is commander. I think he's still commanding 9th Corps at that point, isn't he? Right? Well, he didn't make the division. Was he 9th Corps at Antietam?
He was 9th Corps, yeah.
He was 9th Corps. So him and Jesse Reno were commanding until I think the Renos went out. Because there were 2 Renos. One was killed, mortally wounded at South Mountain. And the other was still present at the Burnside Bridge assault, or the assault on the Rohrbach Bridge, if you will. And Burnside, being somewhat of a close friend of McClellan, too, had some very personal reservations about taking command from a friend who may quite literally have saved him from debt. Burnside's
a man who'd been offered command of the army twice before, right, and refused.
They almost, and they do, they're not even almost, they use sort of leverage on Burnside to get him to accept.
They threaten him with Hooker.
Threaten him with Hooker. That's funny. I might want to.
Essentially, that's what they do. Is they tell they come to Burnside and say, "Hey, listen, we've given you the option twice. You've said no both times. Here's the deal: McClellan is out. Whether you take the job or not, McClellan is out. And if you don't take the job, we're going to give it to Hooker." And Burnside recognized, it's part of the reason why he refused command the 2 times before. Recognized that he was not really quite up to the task. But he trusted Hooker less than he trusted himself, which is maybe saying something. So he finally accepts command in November of 62.
Right.
And he's basically told, okay, great, you got a month and a half to win the war. Yeah, I mean, not quite literally, but that's essentially what he's told, because Lincoln wants this great victory before the end of the year to give the Emancipation Proclamation teeth.
Absolutely. And Lincoln has set his sights on Burnside, and there was a plan formulating under McClellan. It wasn't quite finished or necessarily set in stone, but Fredericksburg was already kind of a sighted city when it came to the AOP, and I think Burnside just modifies that plan drastically.
Right, because Fredericksburg does a bunch of different things for the Army of the Potomac all at once. One, it helps keep it's a direct line to Richmond, obviously. There is a major railroad, the RFMP, Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. Is right there in the name. Mm-hmm. From Richmond through Fredericksburg to Aquia Landing on the Potomac River, which is quite close to D.C.
It is indeed, and in fact, that's a pretty important hub when it comes even later in the war. Aquia Harbor there is just incredibly important to the war effort for the Army. Lincoln himself visiting Aquia Harbor, visiting Burnside, even if I'm not mistaken, in Aquia Harbor before the battle actually outset. So that just show you how important that this hub of transportation really is.
So if you're Burnside and you have basically a month and a half to give Lincoln this grand victory that he wants, you haven't got a whole lot of time for fancy thinking. You've got this half-formed plan from McClellan already that's pointing you towards Fredericksburg.
Right.
Fredericksburg has all these advantages. It shortens your supply lines. It will force Lee to redeploy to protect Richmond, which by definition will protect Washington, because Lee can't threaten Washington if Richmond is in danger, or at least that's the hope, the belief. It gives you a straight shot to Richmond. It gives you a railroad you can use to supply your army. It gives you good roads you can use to move quickly. It all makes sense.
It does, and he tried to keep his plan pretty simple. It looked like Burnside just wanted to get to Richmond and find a staging area to do that, and Fredericksburg just happens to be, like we said, halfway between Washington and Richmond, so it does provide the most strategic route of entry to Richmond. You have the Bowling Green Road, the Richmond Stage Road. These roads all directly lead you one way or another to an avenue of approach to Richmond that could be taken by this army.
Absolutely.
And Burnside knows that Fredericksburg's not necessarily the greatest crossing point, and he does try to reconnoiter further down. But before we even get there, we got to talk about Burnside sending his plans to Washington on November 10th. So once this plan's formulated, the command's been officially switched to Burnside's control. He's going to send his plan into Washington again on November 10th. And with that, he already has an anticipation that everything's going to be already sent to him. All his supplies that he's needed to make this move to Fredericksburg will be in place. And by the time he arrives to Fredericksburg, this speedy, readily available bridge will be there, and his men can be across, establish pretty much a presence in Fredericksburg, and then surprise Lee and move farther south into Richmond. History does tell us that is not how that is going to play out. And we really run into some roadblocks here when it comes to Burnside's plan, and I think a lot of the delay we do later on see when the bridges and stuff don't arrive. We shift that to so many people, but I like to look at the very, very top when it comes to this delay, because a lot of this was intentional. And Frank O'Reilly says it best when we do a description of this man we're about to talk about next. He calls this gentleman an enigmatically bureaucratic soldier. Does anybody, do you have any idea who I might be talking about?
Well, obviously, you're talking about Henry Halleck.
I am very much talking about Henry Halleck, my favorite commander of all time.
Old Brains.
That's right.
Called Old Brains because he wrote military manuals and was believed at one point to be of sound tactical and strategic mind. Perhaps better called Old Brains because his brains were clearly decaying and decrepit. He's kind of a coward.
I agree.
Doesn't like getting into bureaucratic arguments. It's sort of interesting where he's like, Lincoln makes him general in chief specifically, like basically Halleck's job is to solve arguments between army commanders and the White House, and he categorically refuses to do that job.
He does, and in fact, he intentionally does delay Burnside's operations, and we see that because the president and Halleck also didn't really agree with Burnside at first, even though Lincoln was pushing McClellan to take the route nearest to the enemy and really try to take out more or less the communications for the winter campaign. It wasn't necessarily an entire push that they were looking for. It was more so of a harassment, but a continual harassment that McClellan wasn't able to provide for the president. He wanted there to be a constant attack or constant action on the Army of Northern Virginia. McClellan wasn't providing that, so he puts Burnside in a place to provide that, and Burnside comes up with a plan a little bit different than what Lincoln, I guess, had in his mind. So with Lincoln automatically showing a little bit of an approval and withholding that, Halleck kind of seized that opportunity and immediately was begging Burnside for a meeting to carefully consider what Lincoln wanted. Again, Burnside kind of doesn't really do much but modify his plans even further, which gives us another meeting with Halleck. But this time, Halleck actually brings a quartermaster general, Montgomery Mays, and he's also joined by Herman Haupt, who is a very well-known railroad man during the war.
and the director of military railroads for the U.S. military during the war. I
Yeah,
mean, he is the guy who keeps the American military logistical system from collapsing basically during the entire war. Like without Haupt, you don't have a U.S. war effort.
sure. And what I think is interesting in this whole scenario too is when Haupt and Mays and Burnside and Halleck are all meeting together. Haupt is brought with Halleck. Halleck actually brings him for the reason of hoping that Haupt can talk some sense into Burnside and show that his plan isn't as good as he thinks it is. Well, at the end of the meeting, Haupt actually agrees with Burnside, which I'm sure threw Halleck into just some complete and total disarray for the day. He's just like, I brought you down there to support me, and you do this. You take that man's side.
Right? It's like, hey, we can rebuild the bridge and we can get trains going down that railroad. We can keep your army fed and ammunition.
Right, and the plan of attack that I guess that Halleck was trying to insinuate was more so of taking the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which was only a one-track line anyways, and that wasn't going to be able to supply the Army of the Potomac.
That's what they wanted, but it didn't have the capacity.
No, it didn't. I mean, guys, you're bringing close to 1,000 tons of supplies for the Army of the Potomac almost a day.
Mm-hmm.
It's a ridiculous amount of supplies that they need to be fed to be and it's a well-oiled machine, like what people say armies are supposed to be. In order to keep that well-oiled machine maintained, you do have to feed it. You have to take care of its supplies. I mean this is something.
At this point, 130,000, give or take, men in the Army of the Potomac, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of horses. You've got a lot of mouths to feed. You've got a lot of fresh water that has to be supplied. You've got ammunition that has to be replaced when engagements take place. You have to move the wounded back. You have to move replacements forward. I mean, there's kind of a saying that I'm fond of: amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics.
Fair. I like that a lot. Yeah, and that's kind of what we're looking at here with Burnside, Haupt, and Halleck, is that there are two people now in agreement, one of them being an expert in the matter of knowing how these railroads and these transportation system works to get into Fredericksburg. And with that being said, too, you have Halleck now very upset that the man he brought with him isn't necessarily agreeing with him and the president in delaying this operation and trying to really change the way it's going to be done. But eventually, with, I'm sure, hesitation, the plan is approved. Now, from there, maybe you can touch, because we are getting to the point where about an hour and a half into our thing. We want to go ahead and try to close it out at the 1:30 mark, being at 1:23 now. Some closing remarks from you, maybe you can, set up what we're going to talk about next week with a little bit of Fredericksburg, but mainly, obviously, we'll be focusing on Washington. But I would like to kind of keep this conversation going towards the end of our shows to really, dive into Fredericksburg leading up to our eventual Fredericksburg Battle podcast. But
yeah, absolutely.
Where do you want to set us before we close out today at Fredericksburg? Where would you like to leave us off at?
So, I mean, we're in the situation now where Burnside's plan has been approved, kind of reluctantly and kind of over the objections of General Halleck. But, General Halleck can go eat a turkey, drink his wine.
Right.
I'm referencing the Grant documentary because I just love that scene so very much.
That's great.
But the plan has been approved, and Lincoln has told Burnside that, okay, I'm approving your plan, and I think it will work if you move quickly. And that is the golden word here: rapid movement, rapid maneuver. Burnside has got to move fast, and if there's one thing that Robert E. Lee gets known for doing, at least later in the war, it's moving fast. He's not quite known for it yet. He gets called Old Granny at the 7 days outside Richmond.
Right, when he first takes command too.
But if there's one thing that we know about Lee today is that when Lee wants his army to move, his army moves.
It does.
And Burnside has a much larger army, an army that just by its nature of being larger doesn't move as quickly. And it's he has a tall order in front of him to beat old Bobby Lee to Richmond, or to beat old Bobby Lee to Fredericksburg. And there's going to be one very crucial piece of that puzzle that is going to end up going missing.
Right. And I think that's a great way to close this out. But again, guys, this is kind of a trial and error podcast we wanted to do for you guys. I've been trying to do this for a while, and I'm sure John wanted to do something similar. And it's really good to have him join us. So I can't thank you enough for being able to join us for the second episode. And this, I think, was absolutely very productive compared to the last one. The last one was more of a for fun, after dark, whatever. We were just testing the waters to see if it would work. And the last one, I did talk about the first U.S. sharpshooters. My ancestor were in the first U.S. sharpshooters, and then talked about my ancestor in Parker's Virginia Battery. So I'll be working more on that with the information that I've received. I've gotten packet after packet after packet of information from my aunt. I've got the pension records with me. I've got court case pension documents. So once I can get more of an eye for reading these documents that are still untranscribed. So I have so much that I'm reading and learning about diseases that took place within just my family. We'll get more on that, but I just wanted to let you know I'm not done with those. Those are coming up. And John, sure, if you have anything you want to talk about when it comes to regimentals that Wisconsin, right? Or not Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, yeah.
It is Wisconsin, okay.
I have an unhealthy relationship with the Wisconsin regiments, the Iron Brigade in particular. Although I'm becoming real fond of the 3rd Wisconsin.
The 3rd Wisconsin, I have kind of a love for them too at Gettysburg.
Yeah,
they're over there by Willoughby Run, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Yep. That's the one thing.
And at least part of the 3rd Wisconsin actually gets detached to Custer for the cavalry engagement. So there's some weirdness going on with the 3rd Wisconsin.
All right, so they're over there on by the Rommel Barn on East Cavalry Field, right? Or what we would call East Cavalry Field today. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I actually really find that interesting.
If I remember correctly, that's true.
Yeah, that would.
I might that, but
because I know Custer's not at Binkerhoff Ridge. He's at the he's where East Cavalry Field would be, unless that is where it's at, and I'm just blanking on the name. Gettysburg's.
I've been reading through the Siegel Regiment, which is the 26th Wisconsin, who have a very interesting story at Chancellorsville that I think is in some ways quite inspiring. Where you've got this fresh regiment, one of only maybe 6 regiments at best, who are all facing in the correct direction when 28,000 screaming rebels jump out of the woods for Jackson's flank attack, and there's 26 Wisconsin sitting on a little hill outside Hawkins Farm, and we're like, oh well, I guess this is the hill we die on, and they just refuse to leave. And they've never seen combat before. This is their first fight.
So they actually stay compared to a lot. I mean, 95% of the other ones that are just gone.
Their brigade commander Szyznowski literally has to beg them to retreat. What
a baptism by fire that is. Good Lord.
So
well, then please, you get your stuff.
I kind of want to read. It's sort of. I'm almost kind of making it my mission to try and rehabilitate the reputation of the 11th Corps, because I think they get a lot of short shaft, and unjustifiably so.
Well, then I'll start reading through some of Paula's stuff that I've got. I've got the 2 volumes here, and I mean, I definitely think we should make an episode out of the stuff you like with you said it was a 26 Wisconsin, correct? Mm-hmm. I think you should. If there's a regiment you want to speak of, or quite a few regiments you want to speak of, let's make an episode out of it.
I mean, I could talk all day about the Iron Brigade.
I love the Iron Brigade. I got a book back there. Actually, I need to finish reading about the Iron Brigade too. Make an episode out of that. There's so many things to talk about.
Mean, no disrespect to anybody else. The Pennsylvania Reserves, they're badasses. Blogger's Lightning Brigade, they're legendary. The Stonewall Brigade, but nobody fights like the Iron Brigade and the Army of the Potomac at their peak.
I have to say I agree with that very much. The Iron Brigade is just this lone badass brigade that deserves.
I mean, they are
accolades.
They are the Army of the Potomac's problem-solving brigade.
Those damn black hats.
Those damn black hats.
I love it. I mean, like I said, I think this has been a very good second episode, and I hope the folks that are listening really enjoy this. And if you guys have any questions, comments, Twitch is here. Or if you find us on Facebook, the Mr. Coolio page, just like that. And I mean, we may even flirt around with changing the name, obviously, the stream. It's just trial and error. It's the second episode. This one went phenomenal, I think. And I'm really looking forward to Wednesdays with you guys. Again, it'll be me, historian John Launius, and we'll also have historian Steve Pham with us discussing Washington and the Civil War, the day of the 2021 inauguration. And we'll, I think that's going to be fun.
Interesting background context, to be sure.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I'm incredible. That'll be, we'll be doing a live stream of that at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on here, and I'll find a way to try to get a link sent to YouTube. Maybe we can do a dual stream. If not, the links will be in YouTube, Facebook, Twitch. You can find all those. We'll be keeping up with that, and then from there we'll figure out a schedule for the streams. So we might do them Monday, Wednesday. We'll figure out what I guess works for me and John's schedule, but I would love to have him as a reoccurring person here, if not the second host with me, because
I think you'll be seeing me again.
I really hope so, because I think this is incredible, and I'm not sure I want to do this by myself. I would like to have people in here every single time, because that makes it more interesting. It's supposed to be a conversation.
Yeah, it helps to have someone to actually bounce back off of.
Right, and
that's for sure.
I like the minds that I've got around me, man. These guys are wonderful at what they do, and they, keep history alive, and it's something that we need to, have in here, I think, because these opinions and these facts that we're giving out are important, and to the discussion and the talk of Civil War history, and to keep that alive, especially with people in our age group. Because a lot of us that you'll be seeing on this show are very closely in age. We're younger. We're not in the older crowd, and we're the new face of history, as are the younger people listening to this. So to keep that alive and to keep it on the new platforms like Twitch and to like Spotify and YouTube and whatever it may be, I think we need to infiltrate that field a little bit and get some more content out there so that we have more places to read, learn, and conversate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, John, I want to thank you again for joining me on the podcast. If you want to stick around just for a few minutes after I finish, I can just talk to you for a few seconds before you get off, and then we'll go ahead and upload this tonight. It'll be on Spotify by midnight, I imagine, and be on YouTube in about 10 minutes. But everybody, thank you guys for joining in. John, again, thank you for joining on the podcast tonight. And we will see you guys on Wednesday.
Long live the Republic.